Are you looking to stay ahead of the curve in the latest trends in enterprise tech? Look no further than the Breaking Analysis podcast with Dave Vellante. This data-driven program dives into the most important topics facing the enterprise tech industry today. With a data-first approach that leverages ETR's renowned surveys of IT decision-makers and insight from the CUBE community, Breaking Analysis delivers in-depth research on the most important topics facing technologists and IT buyers. Whether you're a business leader, an IT professional, investor, or just an avid follower of the industry, this podcast is a must-listen. Just search Breaking Analysis Podcast wherever you get your podcast and tune in today to stay ahead of the game in enterprise tech.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome back to the Cloudcast. We're coming to you live from our massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. And we have a really special show this week. Some friends of the show that have been friends for quite some time. So we've got Shannon Williams and Darren Shepherd from over at Acorn Labs, but you may know them from Rancher Days and before that Cloud.com as well. So again, they're alumni and special guests because they've been on a number of times, and we've been wanting to talk about Acorn Labs. But not only are we talking about that, when you get this show in the feed, they're also announcing something new. They're announcing Acorn running on AWS. Now, we go into a little bit of depth in the interview. What is Acorns? What is the architecture? What exactly are we abstracting away and why? Really, really good episode. We go a little more in depth than we might usually, and it was fantastic to talk to them and catch up with them. So with that, we're going to get to the interview right after the break.
Today's show is sponsored by Panoptica. Panoptica simplifies container deployment, monitoring, and security, protecting the entire application stack from build to runtime. Scalable across clusters and multi-cloud environments, Panoptica secures containers, serverless APIs, and Kubernetes with a unified view, reducing operational complexity and promoting collaboration by integrating with commonly used developer, SRE, and SecOps tools. Panoptica ensures compliance with regulatory mandates and CIS benchmarks for best practice conformity. Privacy teams can monitor API traffic and identify sensitive data while identifying open source components vulnerable to attacks that require patching. Proactively addressing security issues with Panoptica allows businesses to focus on mitigating critical risks and protecting their interest. Learn more about Panoptica today at panoptica.app. That's panoptica.app.
This episode is supported by Code Comments, an original podcast from Red Hat. You know when you're working on a project and you leave behind a small note in the code, a code comment, to help others learn what isn't clear in the code? This podcast features technologists who've been through the tough tech transitions and share how their teams survived the journey. In each episode, Red Hat's Jamie Parker recounts the behind-the-scenes stories of experienced technologists from across the industry who share what they've learned from implementing new technologies. Episodes are available anywhere you listen to podcasts and at redhat.com/code comments podcast. Search for Code Comments in your favorite podcast player, and we'll also include a link in the show notes. Our thanks to Code Comments for their support.
And we're back. And folks, sometimes we have a chance to do some things that we really love on the show. If you've listened for a while, there's always two things that we love to do on the show. One of them is when we get a chance to highlight new technologies, new companies, because I think at the core, this show has always been about trying to be a little bit forward-looking. And then secondarily, whenever there's a chance that we get a chance to do that with folks that we know, that we've seen build new things, build them successfully, and still have that fire and that passion to do it once again, it's sort of a double dip for us in terms of being excited, in terms of being able to dive into new things. And Aaron, we get a chance to do both those things today. And since this is what I would consider sort of extended family for you, why don't you go ahead and introduce our not only one guest, but two guests today? Because this is folks that I've known for a while. We've had on the podcast before, but you've had a chance to be up close and personal with these two fine gentlemen. So go ahead and do an introduction for us.
Yeah, absolutely. So super interesting because this is one of those, again, we've had both of our guests on the Cloudcast before, but also too, as Brian mentioned, I've actually worked with both of them before. So we want to welcome back to the show. First of all, we have Shannon Williams, president and co-founder at Acorn Labs, and Darren Shepherd, chief architect and co-founder at Acorn Labs. So both of you gentlemen, first of all, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us, Aaron. Brian, it's fantastic to be back on the Cloudcast.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've spoken a few times over the years, and you know, goes back to our time together at cloud.com and then into Citrix. But we've talked about cloud.com, then we've talked about Rancher over the years. But for those that may not be familiar, give everyone just a quick bit of background, and then we're going to jump into Acorn Labs as well.
Sure. Yeah. Hi, everybody. I'm Shannon. As Aaron said, I'm one of the founders of Acorn and have been working with Aaron, but Darren and Shen and Will, a big group of people for, I guess, 15 years now, building cloud computing software. Our first company, cloud.com, was started in about 2008. We built a product called CloudStack, which was a really early implementation of infrastructure as a service software that you could build to run private clouds. We were founding members of the OpenStack Foundation and really worked on that first generation of cloud computing as people tried to build their own versions of EC2 and their own versions of infrastructure as a service. And then that company was acquired by Citrix. After that, we spent about 3 years working at Citrix before leaving to start Rancher. And Rancher was started in 2014, and that's where Darren and our team really worked on building out a platform to make containers consumable for individuals and organizations. And we've done all this in open source. CloudStack was open source, Rancher is open source. And we just had a great time building sort of open source cloud computing platforms. Obviously, Rancher became really well known for running Kubernetes and building Kubernetes clusters, and remains the leading way to manage open source Kubernetes clusters and build them and deploy them anywhere. And so we worked on that. That company was acquired by SUSE back during the pandemic, and stayed there for a while. But last year we left to go for round 3 of starting companies, and the company we started then was Acorn. And Acorn is a really exciting project. We really driven so much by Darren. Darren's sort of strong belief that there was a better way to work with application infrastructure and applications than where we had kind of taken things with Kubernetes, with containers, with kind of implementing infrastructure first approaches to building applications, where everything was infrastructure led. You wanted a load balancer, you wanted to run something, you wanted infrastructure. So with Acorn, Darren has sort of approached things as how do I make this something that developers will love to work with, that users will really love? And I think he can talk more about that, but that's really been, what caused us to want to do a third startup. And we all love working together. Amazingly, after 15 years, we actually like each other still.
Yeah. I was just thinking about that is like, it's like, why do this again? It's like, fundamentally, like, we enjoy working together. But like just yesterday, I was arguing with Shane. That's another one of our co-founders. It's the amount that we argue, and now question how much I actually enjoy this. It's like,
sure.
Why did I sign up to do this yet again?
Yeah. So Darren, I'm curious. Lots of folks have met you in person, but you're sort of a fascinating personality on Twitter and places. You sort of fluctuate between evil genius in terms of coming up and your team building lots of new things and being what feels like, I don't want to say like constantly frustrated, but constantly sort of questioning, like, why did you guys do this? Why am I having to fix somebody else's thing? And so, like, is Acorn sort of at that I don't know, Venn diagram between evil genius, like loves to invent things, and frustrated that you're having to deal with other people's whatever consensus fixes?
It's like, as Shannon was saying, like, he's like, like gave me some credit for like kind of the belief or vision of Acorn. And it's like, no, this is completely driven out of frustration. It's like, if anyone follows me on Twitter, it's like, I'm just constantly frustrated with everything. And so it's like, it's a combination of like me, everything that I've done, like we've done in this infrastructure space is like, we build the platforms, but like I'm also a user of the platform. So it's like, I understand how they're built, but I'm also a user. So I get frustrated as a user of just like, oh my gosh, like we put all this effort and we've built this thing. And then as a user, it's so difficult to use. And I get so frustrated. So it's like what we're doing with Acorn is this, like, I'm kind of frustrated with the complexity and the difficulty of the space that we've effectively created over the last 10, 15 years. So like I'm frustrated with it, and then I think naively think I can make it better. So like that's what Acorn is hopefully we can somehow make this better. And we'll see.
Sure. And so let's kind of dig in there for a second. So at a higher level, because I know we have an announcement we want to talk about, but we're kind of calling this segment, if you will, application development frameworks. And can you explain to everyone what is meant by that and kind of what the problem is that you're really trying to solve with Acorn Labs?
Yeah. So it's like, this is such like, it's a hard thing to describe because when you say application development, like there's so many things involved in that. There's so many things of like, well, how do I actually write the code? Like, let's say IDE or tooling to actually write code, but then how do I package the code? How do I deploy the code? How do I test the code? How do I run the code? How do I manage the code in production? Right. So when I look at this, it's like the end to end of like when a developer writes something to how do I get it to the end running that application in production? Like that's what I'm kind of looking at, like that whole scope, that whole pipeline of everything of like, how do you kind of simplify and make that easier? So it's like, because at the end of the day, it's like my goal is I just want to run an app in production, but like the amount of hoops I have to jump through is so much. So it's like, that's what I kind of look at is just like, what's the end-to-end process and how do I make that significantly easier? But I don't know, Shannon, you want to take a stab at this?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think that's a good broad analyst type term, right? Application development framework. I think the reality of these things is, how we build applications is pretty consistent. Has been pretty consistent the last couple of years, maybe even the last decade. We have development teams, they build their applications, they sort of work on their laptops, they work in containers, they use Docker Compose to test a bunch of stuff out, they pull down, local versions of cloud services to see everything working together. And once everything kind of works together, they sort of throw it over to integration and they throw it over to testing and they throw it over eventually to DevOps to figure out how to take all of that and turn it into the actual thing that's going to run on a different type of infrastructure, connecting to actual cloud services, talking to real databases and data services. And that disconnect, that like I work in one world, I dev and I integrate and test in sort of a secondary world. I see the final output in the third, kind of actual production environments or staging to production environments. I think that's where one of the areas we feel the most frustration coming back to us from orgs is just that it's really hard and it makes debugging nearly impossible. When I have a problem in prod, I've kind of got to re-engineer all the way back to my local machine to see if I can figure out why I ended up there. And so a lot of what drove our thinking about Acorn was, well, why did we end up here? Like Docker was supposed to solve this. We were supposed to write and have Docker and then run to Docker, and Docker would be what was in the cloud. And so, the environments would be pretty static from the moment I wrote it till it was actually running out there. But obviously we introduced Kubernetes, and Kubernetes became, the sort of manifestation of infrastructure as an API that you could talk to consistently across all the clouds and across your data center. But that framework was very infrastructure centric, not very application centric, because it had to consume all infrastructure, universes. And so what we've been thinking about with Acorn is what if, can we abstract Kubernetes and bring it back to this developer world where all of its functionality can actually work at the developer level, and a developer can write and see it all working very easily and then push to something that's identical when it gets into production. And so what we've been working on the last year is a service that we're launching right now, which is Acorn in the cloud. It's a Acorn basically running initially on AWS, where users can get an account and effectively, see all of the power of, application development environments, and that where production and development are fully identical, so that the toolkit that you use to build the application and the toolkit you use to run the application are there's no delta anymore. And so we've implemented that in a way where, as a user, when you're building your app, you're actually building directly with, if you want to use an RDS database, you're building with an RDS database. You're building, and you want to use Lambda, you're building with Lambda. And instead of trying to recreate all those things locally and build with them, you're now, kind of building directly in the cloud and then pushing to develop, kind of test environments that are also right there in the cloud, and production environments that are in the cloud, but that all feel exactly like what you're used to as a developer working on locally. And Darren's really done a great job of, thinking this through and building it in a way that I think people are going to just love, because the sandbox environments that you get when you just sign up, it really allows you to do amazing things, within minutes, in terms of spinning up just about any kind of stack and workload, and taking it all the way through to production. Yeah,
I want to clarify one thing, and I have a follow-up question. So clarification for anybody who's listening. Shannon mentioned they're launching the service on the day when this published. We're recording this a little bit early. So if you happen to click on the link that's in the show notes and it's not there, it's a great opportunity to go reach out to Shannon and Darren and be like, hey, I'm interested in this stuff, but don't be upset at him if we're off by a day or something. So things happen. So here's my follow-up question. So we've heard for a long time, you guys have been around Kubernetes forever, right? Kelsey Hightower famously said, like, Kubernetes was never really designed for developers. It was designed as a platform to build platforms on top of. Mm-hmm. And we've all sort of lived through, the PaaS is going to fix everything for developers. PaaS is dead. We've lived through those sort of cycles. Is the way you guys are going, because the problem with the sort of, I just want to deploy an application, which has always been the goal. That's never really changed. The problem has always been that the environments are different, or the opinionation that you have to put in to be able to do that at some point restricts some sort of application, right? And for lots of reasons. Like, is the approach to this that you go, well, I'm going to run this almost exclusively on cloud services, so I don't really have to worry about like your company doing some weird thing with networking or weird thing with the database, because the cloud kind of restricts sort of some of those things as it is. And the assumption is just like you said, because the dev environment has to be the same as the sort of prod environment, you get around some of that. I guess I'm ultimately asking, like, not what's new and novel for this, but like, what's the sort of thought process of like, there's a new way to get around this sort of PaaS or opinionation problem that people have had for a long time?
Yeah, and I think this is the trick of, like, because it's like, on the one hand, you have Kubernetes, which is very infrastructure, like operations focused, amazing platform, but just, very low level. Then on the other side, you have PaaS, which is like very like developer oriented, but very restrictive in what you can actually accomplish. Like, because it's very oriented towards just kind of single application. It's automatically build your code and whatnot. So it's like, you have these two solutions which are on two like opposite ends of the spectrum. And like, one of my frustrations have always been is like we have the Kubernetes container layer, and then everyone just always assumes, well, if I'm going to build the next layer up, it's PaaS. But it's like, no, there's something in between there. And that's the trick of like what we're trying to do with Acorn is like, is there a reasonable abstraction that exists in between kind of what we have as Kubernetes and what we have as PaaS that is generally useful? And that's really kind of what's hard, is trying to figure out what's the proper level of abstraction. And I think what's different these days is just really the experience of, it's like we have enough experience of like, not I'm saying us personally, us as an industry, have enough experience of running, it's like long legacy of running things on premises in data centers, and then now a good history of running things in the cloud, and now a good history of running things on Kubernetes in containers, that like we have enough examples of good patterns to deploy this stuff, that what we can do with Acorn is now say, okay, like we've kind of figured out a lot of the patterns on what's the best way to do this. Where do we need to split it into kind of what does the user and application care about and what does the infrastructure care about? And so that's the big thing of like what we're doing with Acorn is we've managed to create an abstraction where it's like on one side it kind of addresses all the concerns I have from just deploying and running applications, and then on the other side it can address all the concerns of how I want to manage and tailor my infrastructure for those applications. So it's like what we're doing is not fundamentally different. It's just that we've figured out a good segregation of kind of who can do what and who cares about what. And it's just based off of kind of the experience of running this stuff for so long.
Well, I think a great add-on to that, Darren, if you think about so many PaaSes, right? Like you said, they start with things like build packs, and they're language specific. They focus on a set of data services that are usually provided by the PaaS. You think Heroku or Cloud Foundry, like, oh, here's our data, here's our relational database, right? And the reality is like that doesn't really make any sense in modern application development, where so often there's constant change on things like databases and external services and how I want to connect everything together. And so one of the fun things about building Acorn was, we started with AWS. We're like, okay, well, let's just kind of start with the biggest platform and we'll kind of consume from there. And, the richness of services that AWS does really well means that you're not out building, here's the Acorn version of a database. You're just like, oh, we're in AWS. We're probably going to use RDS. And if we go to Azure, we're going to use, their implementation of SQL database. And we should probably also use their other database and other services. But to be honest with you, sometimes we're going to want to get outside of those. So we're going to want to do Mongo. And if we're doing Mongo, do we want to have an implementation of the open source Mongo? Sure, that's one way that someone might implement it, but a lot of people are actually going to just want to go get Atlas and Mongo's hosted service. And so what we tried to build in Acorn is this concept of nested acorns, and that you would, you have your application, but you also are consuming these cloud services where it's mostly about, identifying yourself and connecting to the service, instantiating an instance, and then incorporating that into an image that you can deploy or redeploy or deploy consecutively, consistently in the same way. So we're really leaning on the reality of modern application design, consuming so many cloud services to kind of rethink how an application platform thinks about its connections and the services that it provides beyond the code, right? Beyond your actual application code.
Yeah.
Go. I was going to say something real quick too. It's like, this is one of those podcasts where, again, audio only, right? I wish we had a whiteboard. But I will say this. So like to maybe, clarify this and make sure, everyone is on the same page here. So completely understand, like, it's that bridge concept, right? You've got developers at one side and infrastructure at the other side. And how are you extending that bridge? But then this abstraction layer, let's talk about that just a little bit more. So you, of course, have your Kubernetes layer, and then you have, that application layer at the very, very top, or that PaaS layer at the very top. But what we're talking about here is really an intermediate abstraction layer that is a bit of is it like a customer runtime that sits in between and on top of Kubernetes, Darren? Is that a correct way to, I know it may be oversimplification, but is that a good way to think about it?
So it's, because it's like at the end of the day, like we have extremely powerful, very good runtimes. It's like Kubernetes is very good. AWS is really good. So what Acorn is an abstraction layer that basically, because it is, I guess, basically a runtime, but like fundamentally it's still Kubernetes and AWS, that's the runtime. But it's this abstraction layer that introduces a couple concepts of how you can basically package, describe, and run your applications. The way Acorn works is like, if you look at, like, we have the Docker container, And like when we had Docker originally, it's like when Docker first came out, it's like, oh, a container, that's an application. I can just run a container and, like I'll just run the container and it's in production. But as we had Kubernetes, it became obvious that like the container is not sufficient to describe your application. Like that's why we have like Helm charts and whatnot. There's a lot more metadata and stuff to actually describe a running application. So what we've done in Acorn is we've created like what we call the Acorn image, which is this kind of new unit to package up Docker images plus a bunch of metadata. So you can package up, this unit to run your application. But these Acorns are completely composable in that, like, I can have multiple ones, I can nest them, I can it becomes this new unit that I can deploy. So Acorn is very much focused on basically kind of packaging up your applications and the metadata required to run your applications, and then connecting it to other things like services and whatnot. And so it's this language basically to package and describe your application and run it that kind of this kind of just basic abstraction greatly simplifies, kind of have the whole end-to-end experience.
That makes sense. And it also really helps too, because I think one of the common problems we've really had is anytime you abstract something, you almost remove a bit of the specificity. And what I mean by that is, like, let's say you mentioned AWS, for this today, right? We can do an abstraction, but when we abstract, we almost take away some of the uniqueness of AWS, because you want to be able to run it on GCP or you want to be able to run it other places. And so what you're really getting at here is you're abstracting away, but maintaining specificity all at the same time. Is that a correct statement?
What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Like it's exactly that, because what we found with Kubernetes is that you can implement Kubernetes on any cloud and get a compute runtime there. But the reality is that's not sufficient to build your application, right? To build your application, you need to incorporate data services, and you need to understand the networking model of that, and you understand how traffic works and even costs, and so much that you're exactly right. That when you're in the AWS world, you need expertise. And it's a lot of expertise that typically a startup, a developer, anyone building new things lacks as they consume these things. And so what we really kind of realized as we were building Acorn was that Acorn does a great job of taking what developers like to work with, containers, services, and instantiating it on infrastructure. But it's written in a way that allows almost like Terraform like wrapping of services, so that you can incorporate those services really easily into a developer's toolbox. And so what you end up with is this toolbox where all the cloud services in AWS that you need to consume, plus all of the application logic that you're writing, is really at your fingertips as a developer, so that it's really like working with Docker Compose. I think that's probably the single biggest influence on Acorn is Docker Compose. This idea that, right after Docker came out, the big was like, oh, now I can use Docker Compose to say, start container 1 and container 2 and then connect them. And, that's where we ended up with Kubernetes, is all this logic and metadata, as Darren said, about how it should run and what it should connect to and how much tolerances it should have for failure, and, where those images should exist on the infrastructure, and all sorts of other pieces of logic. And what the reality is if we can kind of bring that back into a common language that developers use to describe their application, then the consumption of clouds is, while still specific, right? I want to run in AWS. I want to use RDS. I want to use Lambda. I want to use all the great things about AWS. It's totally grokkable, if that makes sense. I can understand it. I can see it. I was like, oh, cool. I'm just like slotting these things in. And so a lot of what Acorn actually does in the background is dealing with IAM and dealing with provisioning and dealing with, usage of consumption and like helping use that developer understand what they're consuming. So the way we built Acorn, the cloud service, you come in, you just provide your Git credentials, and you immediately get an account with a free sandbox that you can run anything for up to 2 hours for free. And so you get in there, you can dev, you can try things, you can use services like Lambda and RDS and SQS and S3 buckets, and you can do all these things as you're building. And then when you're ready to move to production, you provide your AWS credentials, and we then, kind of create infrastructure for you in AWS. And you still pay Amazon for all that infrastructure, but your experience using it is, really connected to that developer experience, that Acorn platform, that ease of use that Acorn gives you. So Acorn is providing you this framework and this abstraction, this way to describe everything. And it's taking care of all the management of those AWS resources for you. So we're spinning up nodes, and we're, managing IAM, and we're hooking in your databases and deprovisioning them when you're done, and making sure that everything's been turned off that you're not consuming. And, you still have an AWS account, you still get an AWS bill, and, all of that is included in the free account. So when you just, when you sign up in Acorn and you get started, you get this ability to work, quickly and easily in a sandbox. And then when you're ready, push it to, a production environment that's running on dedicated infrastructure, no longer in a shared sandbox, but now on your infrastructure that you're paying AWS for. And if you're a startup, that means you're using your credits. And, if you have an enterprise account, you're using, your enterprise infrastructure as defined by your organization. And as long as you're just working by yourself, all of that is free. Our model is kind of like GitHub. It's only when you start to, want to work as a team and collaborate, that's where we have sort of paid plans, and you begin to move into the commercial version of Acorn that says, oh, okay, you want to connect 10 people and collaborate and create a lot of different environments and set policies and things like that. Then we have enterprise and commercial versions that hopefully we can sell and build a business around. But the core technology, Acorn, is open source. The runtime, as you called it, that's all open source. Anybody can deploy it on any Kubernetes and get this same experience. And then in the cloud service, we're just doing all that wiring up and giving people hopefully an amazing sandbox where they can go and present and, kind of create really cool deployments and share them with people. Like once you've created something, you create an Acorn image, you can, share it with anybody. You can share that link, and anybody else can instantiate their own instance of whatever you've created for free in their sandbox. So that's the UX we're going for, is collaboration, really inspired by GitHub more than anything. How do we get people writing, creating, sharing, reinstantiating, and doing it all, very easily and without a lot of friction?
And so let me maybe take it one step further then, because as I'm thinking through this, because I mean, a problem I feel like Kubernetes has always had, or just not even Kubernetes, containers, and has always had, is like when you broke everything down into a microservices architecture, well, now what does an app mean anymore? Well, it was kind of like this grouping of containers with this database and, maybe there's like this kind of technology for messaging or all these other things. And it became the whole concept of an application kind of went by the wayside. And so what you're introducing here is almost like an encapsulation that kind of says, hey, this is my app, right? And give me all of these things, all of these services, and pin it all together or wire it all together, and then just go run it. Is that kind of a correct way to think about it?
It is. I mean, like, because this has always come up before. People are like, it's like, what is an application? What's the definition of an application? And it's like, and people have tried, let's say even in Kubernetes, they'll be like, I created an app custom resource, and this describes an application. It's like everyone has tried this to define what an app is, but there is not a clear definition between two teams. They have they'll kind of, is it just your container? Is a container plus this? It's a container, but it also includes the database. But anyways, so what we're trying to do with Acorn is like basically allow you to decide what your application is and compose it yourself. It's like, we're just basically like, we've come up with this Acorn image, or the Acorn, which is a new building block that allows you to basically say, okay, well, your app can just be a single Acorn if you want, but let's say, like, my application actually includes 3 applications. It's composed of 3 applications. Well, great. Then just take those Acorns, compose 3 of them together, put that into another Acorn, and now that's your new definition of an application. So it's like we're very kind of conscious of like how we use that term application, of knowing that everyone's interpretation of that is different. And what we're trying to do with Acorn is just give you a new building block that you can just very easily compose these things together. I keep going back in my mind, like you're saying about like the specificity, is that like, is I don't think there's one answer of like, what's the like, what is the proper abstraction layer of X? It's like, it kind of always depends on how much do you bleed through and how much do you not. And so what Acorn allows you to do is build the units that you want. You can build Acorns, and you can kind of specify like what are the things you expose? What are the knobs people can tweak? So you can create a database service that has no knobs and everyone just gets the same thing. Or you can create one that has 100 knobs and you can tweak it however you want. It's like with Acorn, we're just giving you this new building block.
Nice. And I think actually that's a fantastic place to kind of close this out. I really appreciate that. Both Darren and Shannon, thank you very much. And where can everyone go to find out more? And of course, we've got conferences coming up as well. So where can everyone kind of find y'all if they want to as well?
Yeah, well, we will be, the easiest place to check this out is acorn.io. You can come sign up with your GitHub and launch your first Acorn, see what it's like, inspect it, understand how it works. If you're at reInvent or KubeCon, we'll be there. We've got booths. We'll be giving out T-shirts and saying hi to old friends. So yeah, swing by, say hello, and give us your thoughts. We're just starting the public beta. So for the last couple months, we've been doing private betas. Now we're out. Anybody can get an account. We'll probably be in beta for at least 4 to 6 months as we work through issues, but we're really excited. I think the experience so far, the developer experience on this, when you can take a deployment and just move it into dev mode and do all sorts of cool things, I think people are going to really like it. The response from early beta users has been way more positive than anything we've ever done before. We're usually pretty hacky early on, so it's really exciting for us. I mean, so as open source people, we're always building apps. It's rare that we've got the chance to launch a SaaS or something where people can actually use it day one. So we're super excited to try this model. So thanks so much, Brian, Aaron, for having us. This is always a blast to talk to you guys.
Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah, thanks.
All right. So I'm going to wrap us up then. So on behalf of Brian and myself, thank you everyone for listening this week. We certainly hope you've enjoyed the show. And certainly if you have any ideas for guests or feedback, or if you can leave a review or tell a friend, we certainly encourage you to do that as well. And so I'm going to close this out for this week, and we will talk to everyone next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.